Hello, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson House Speaker Series. My name is Elizabeth Karcher. I am the Executive Director of the Woodrow Wilson House, a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Today, we have a great talk about Edith Wilson. She was actually what I call the first curator of this house, and it is really my pleasure to welcome our guest speakers. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know a little bit about what's going on at the Wilson House. We have the speaker series is continuing. It is always held on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month. And we've got notable historians, authors, curators, and leaders, and they are exploring social movements of the early 20th century and their relevance today. The talks explore women's suffrage, activism and protest, racial inequity, and the consequences and legacy of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The speaker series is brought to you through generous donations from Carrie Fuller, Nancy Bliss, Ed Gerber, and Chris Keller. We have today with us Rebecca Boggs Roberts and Heath Hardage Lee discussing Edith Wilson, brave, beautiful, and complicated. Do you know that Edith Wilson lived an extraordinary life? She was one of the first women in Washington, D.C. to have a driver's license and drive her own car. And yet she did not know how to ride a bike until she was taught by the president in the basement of the White House. She was the first lady to vote in a national election, since women did not get the right to vote until 1920. And yet she did not support the suffrage movement. Today, we're going to learn about this amazing woman whose calling card simply read, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. With that, I would like to introduce our first presenter, and that is Heath Hardage Lee. She and I met 2 summers ago when I very first started working at the Wilson House, and we sat down and we talked about a biography that she had intended to write about Edith, and so we got to know each other then. Heath comes from a museum education, preservation, and program background. She holds a BA in history with honors from Davidson College and an MA in French language and literature from the University of Virginia. Heath is an independent historian, biographer, and curator. Potomac Books, a division of the University of Nebraska Press, published Heath's prize-winning book, Winnie Davis, Daughter of the Lost Cause, in 2014. Heath's narrative fiction book entitled The League of Wives, The Untold Story of the Women Who Took on the US government to bring their husbands home from Vietnam, was published by St. Martin's Press in April of 2019. Heath was the 2017 Robert Dole Curatorial Fellow, and her exhibition entitled The League of Wives, Vietnam POW and MIA Advocates and Allies, about the Vietnam POW MIA wives. It premiered at the Dole Institute of Politics in May of 2017. The exhibit is currently traveling through 2023 to museum venues all over the United States, including the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Actress Reese Witherspoon and her production company, Hello Sunshine, in partnership with Sony 3000, have optioned The League of Wives for a feature film. Heath is an executive producer and historical consultant for the project. Heath's next book is a new biography of First Lady Pat Nixon, and it's expected to come out from St. Martin's Press in 2024. She's most recently worked on the project with the Smithsonian, and that is Madam President. It is season 2, episode 3, and it was on the Smithsonian Channel's America's Hidden Mysteries. With that, I'd like to welcome Heath Lee.
This is Edith, who clearly does not like wearing pants. This is very of a piece with her personality. She becomes a very feminine person, extremely feminine. And I think she really was quite angry that her family had put her in pants. I don't think she ever wanted to be in pants her entire life. There is some speculation from my contacts at the museum that she was put in these pants to tend the fires at the house, which is possible, but she was probably 3 to 5 years old in this photo. So that's a bit young, even back in the day, to be tending the fires. So the other theory about this photograph is that these were just hand-me-downs from her brothers. And, again, they didn't have a lot of money. They had to use everything they had. So it's possible she's just wearing hand-me-downs and she's extremely angry about it. Regardless, it's a priceless picture. I feel fairly sure that Rebecca will probably use this in her book. It's very indicative of her personality, I think. I personally love this picture. I think it says quite a bit about Edith's character and her likes and dislikes. So we'll go on to the next slide. Now, very, very important to Edith's life are both of her grandmothers. The entire family, it was an extended family that lived in these apartments above the commercial spaces in Wytheville. They had up to 20 people at a time living in this very small space. So they were all together quite a lot, probably more than any of them wanted to be. Post-war, the two grandmothers, Sally's mother and William's mother, both, I'll talk about various reasons why, but they both ended up living in Wytheville with Edith, with William and Sally and all the children. So we'll start with William's mother, Anne Wigginton Bolling, grandmother Bolling to Edith. So she was sort of the ruling matriarch, ruling the roost here. She was widowed in 1862, so before the end of the war, but she moved in with William's family and moved with them to Wytheville. She was incapacitated as a young woman. Edith says in her memoir it was probably from a riding accident, so there was some kind of spinal injury, and grandmother Bolling had to have help really all the time, night and day. Edith became her favorite grandchild. There were many, many children. Edith was one of 7. 2 of these children, Sally's children, died in infancy, but there were a pack of children in the house. Edith was grandmother Bolling's favorite, lucky Edith. I think this was a dubious honor that she had because she literally took care of her grandmother 24/7, night, day, anything grandmother Bolling wanted. Edith was sort of at her beck and call. So this does form a lot of her caregiver tendencies that come into play later with Woodrow Wilson. So in addition to taking care of her grandmother had 26 very annoying canaries that I'll talk about a lot today. And that was part of Edith's charge, is to take care of the canaries as well as her grandmother. In Edith's book, my memoir, which I will continue talking about a lot today, Edith later said of grandmother Bolling that she was, quote, an unusually capable and dominant person to whom an obstacle meant only something to overcome, end quote. Again, I think that quote is very indicative of Edith's personality and how much it was formed by this very demanding but loving grandmother. Her tendency also to form strong opinions, I think, came from grandmother Bolling. And the role of women, both of the grandmothers, I think Edith absorbs this from this close relationship with both of them. Now let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about her other grandmother, grandmother Longwood. So grandmother Longwood is the one, I think, who forms the majority of Edith's ideas about a woman's place. And we'll talk about that in just a second. She was Sally's mother. She was widowed in 1860 and lived also with the Bollings in Wytheville from 1866 on. She was very tall, very dignified, very ladylike. She was the one who was always telling Edith to sit up straight, to have good posture and never to show her ankles, God forbid. I mean, who knows what could happen. So she was very strict about propriety, how you were dressed, all of that kind of thing. Despite the pants episode earlier, usually Edith was dressed, in a very ladylike, dignified manner. Edith remembered her very fondly for her cooking, for her delicious coconut balls, and praline. So I think she indulged Edith and the other children with those from time to time, and that made quite an impression on Edith. She really absorbed ideas from her about the feminine ideal. And I think particularly the idea about the cult of true womanhood or the cult of domesticity, which you will read and learn a lot about in the 19th century. And this sort of prescription for women at the time said they should be pious, pure, and submissive. So Edith is absorbing this really from both grandmothers, I think more strongly perhaps from grandmother Longwood. But what I think is so fascinating about Edith is there's this sort of push-pull within her. Like, she knows about this cult of domesticity. She knows about the cult of true womanhood, and she kind of buys it on the surface, but she is very opinionated, very much wants to do what she wants to do. And Rebecca will tell you about some of her later life, that she demonstrates really the tendencies of the new woman, of a more liberated and maybe more enlightened feminine ideal. But these two things are really at war with her, I think, a lot during her life, different phases of her life. So I find that quite interesting. But this is where she gets that early training in the pious, pure, submissive mode, which she does not always follow later in life. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and we're getting pure canary here. So Edith with the bird cage. If you go visit the museum today, you will see these bird cages, and she is thinking how much she hates these darn canaries that are the bane of her existence. I think I would be remiss if I did not really emphasize this. As I said, one of her many jobs as grandmother Bolling's caretaker was to clean out these canary cages and take care of the creatures. Her favorite thing in the world was when the canaries died, was to have canary funerals for them. And when I did the Smithsonian documentary, if anyone watches that, I have my daughter, Ann Alston, will talk to you later about how completely strange she thought this was. We talk a lot in the documentary about how there must have not been a lot to do in Wytheville at the time, because this was Edith's major amusement, and her brothers, they all loved to have canary funerals. And again, to quote from my memoir from Edith, her quote about the canaries, quote, "What was to me the greatest hardship of my young life? Taking care of the cages for 26 canaries and acting as providence for them in births, deaths, and the raising of their broods. Personally, the only real fun I ever got out of the canaries is when we would find a young one that had been crowded out of the nest and lay stark and hideous on the floor of its cage, awaiting burial. We would put the little dead bird in a spool box, place it in our red wagon, and have an interment in the bird cemetery. We would go to the marble yard and get a chip cut from a big slab and write on it the name and date and the death of the deceased." I mean, it sounds like fun to me. I thought it was very, very creative. I think it shows a great sense of humor that Edith had. So I enjoyed talking about this with my daughter, who I'm not sure if she found it quite as amusing as I did, but I know Rebecca also has a love for the dead canaries. So I think they're a recurring theme that will come up quite a bit during our talk. And let's go to my last slide for today. I love this picture of Edith as a young woman. Here she's probably between 18 and 21. She really is a beautiful young woman. She has kind of a Elizabeth Taylor look to her, these sort of violet eyes, and she's very shapely. I think Woodrow Wilson, obviously is very smitten with her later. And she did have a first husband before Woodrow Wilson that Rebecca will tell you about. But I'm just going to talk you through her schooling, or lack thereof in some cases, before she comes to her first marriage. So in terms of her education, she was homeschooled by her father, William, who read out loud a lot to her, a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of plays, and grandmother Bolling, who was really in charge of her education, and I think really screwed up her French. I have an MA in French, and I was distressed to hear about grandmother Bolling's French English sort of mix. It was mostly reading French, not speaking French. So I'm not sure that Edith got that completely correct, but I give Grandmother Bolling points for trying to educate her in French, which was what young ladies in the 19th century needed to have. At 15, though, she finally stops. Really, at age 12, her parents decide that Grandmother Bolling is really wearing her out and she needs a rest. So she gets more of a break from Grandmother Bolling at that point. And at 15, she's sent to Abingdon, Virginia, to a boarding school that was then called Martha Washington College. This has now evolved into Emory and Henry College, but at the time it was a boarding school. And Edith absolutely hated it. Despised it. She only stayed for one semester. She said they were way too strict, narrow-minded. I think the rooms were very cold. This was very true in the 19th century. In one of my other books about Winnie Davis, another 19th century woman I wrote about, she was in German boarding school, had the same issue where really it was freezing cold in the mornings when the girls would get up. There was never enough food at these boarding schools. So I think Edith had some legitimate gripes there, but I think she also was used to kind of doing her own thing, and it was much too strict for her. So she came home after a semester, stayed home for 2 years, and tried again at age 17, and this time had a much more successful time when she went to Powell's boarding school in Richmond. And she loved this boarding school, one, because it was in the big city of Richmond. She talked about, the seething sea of humanity she saw there. So Richmond at the time was, it was a big town. It was very much the big city for a girl from Wytheville, and loved the school. But unfortunately, the headmaster got into a streetcar accident and injured his leg very badly. So the school was shut down. And she later would say this was the happiest time of her life. And she made a lot of lifelong friends that she kept up with from this school. She was very sad when they were forced to close. She went home and her family said they really just did not have the money to continue to send her to school. They needed to send her 3 brothers to school. So that was really the end of Edith's schooling. And I think she really did regret that she didn't get to do more at Powell's. I think she would have stayed if she could have. So I'm going to wrap up my part there, but I want to introduce you to my friend Rebecca, who is writing a fabulous new biography of Edith Wilson, and we're all super excited to read this. But I want to just give you a little background first on Rebecca before she talks about Edith's later life. Rebecca Boggs Roberts has been many things, including, but not limited to, a journalist, a producer, a tour guide, a forensic anthropologist, an event planner, political consultant, jazz singer, and radio talk show host. Currently, she is the curator of programming for Planet Word Museum. She looks forward to creating a new institution that will become part of the intellectual and cultural life of our capital city. Rebecca lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, her 3 sons, and a big fat dog named Sassy, the chocolate lab. And she also has a new dog, Woodley, who is her pandemic dog. So I will let Rebecca take over, and thank you Elizabeth for having me today.
Heath, thank you so much. And with any luck, neither Sassy nor Woodley will participate in our Zoom today, but all bets are off when we're all working from home.
Who knows?
So what Heath didn't say is she has been incredibly generous with me. She got sidetracked from Edith to write about Pat Nixon and has just been so wildly open and collegial in introducing me to the people she's met in the Edith research she's already done. And we get to talk about how much she hated those canaries and try to get some sense of this complicated woman. And I came to Edith because I've written 2 books on the suffrage movement, and people always ask me about Edith when I do talks on suffrage. They ask if maybe she was whispering in Wilson's ear, and that's why he came around to the suffrage cause later in his presidency, or, did she influence him in some way? Or if they know she was anti-suffrage, which she was, They wonder how this, confident, independent woman justified being anti-suffrage, which is a conundrum, absolutely. But I think that Heath really is getting at something with this warring instincts of this cult of true womanhood and this, what a nice girl does with the reality of the 20th century modern woman Edith actually was. And, people say that the First Lady, since it has no job description, often reflects what the ideal woman in America is at that time. And the ideal woman in 1916 to 1920, when Edith was First Lady, was really evolving. And so was she. And I think that the people who concentrate on the 15 months when Wilson, or 18 months, if you go all the way to Harding's inauguration in 1921, when Wilson had his stroke and Edith was his gatekeeper, you find that episode sort of shocking, right? You can make an argument that the Madam President stuff is a little overblown. She wasn't actually making policy. She wasn't necessarily doing anything that Wilson wouldn't have done. But the fact remains that she insisted that the nation not know the extent of his health problems. She wouldn't hear of Vice President Thomas Marshall having any role, and the 25th Amendment didn't exist, so she couldn't be pushed on that. And she was his gatekeeper, deciding what business of the country got done during that time. And he was not up to the task of doing the job he was elected to do. And to the degree that anybody was doing the job that Wilson was elected to do in that time, it was Edith, who, of course, no one had voted for anything. So if you just take that chapter from Wilson's stroke in the fall of 1919 to the inauguration of Harding in March of 1921, you think, what is going on? Where did this woman come from with this lack of formal schooling? Who did she think she was? Well, who did she think she was? She thought she was an independent, accomplished, confident woman. And if you look at her whole life, you realize that there is example after example after example of her showing you who she is. So in 1892, Edith comes here to town. And Washington in the 1890s was booming. It was a fascinating place. The city had been so beaten down by the Civil War that there was real talk of moving the capital west to St. Louis, maybe. And so the city fathers, led by the notorious Boss Shepherd, went on a crazy public works project to try to make Washington livable and appealing. So they graded and paved the roads. They instituted a sewer system and street lighting. And so there was money pouring into the city. There was a sense that it really was going to be a world capital. And also socially, a lot of those brand new Gilded Age robber baron fortunes that were being made, those people couldn't break into society in New York and Boston. The Knickerbockers in New York and the Brahmins in Boston wanted no part of them, no matter how rich they were. But you could break into society here in Washington. It was a much more fluid caste system. And with the comings and goings of administrations, and it just wasn't as old a city, right? It had been founded right around the turn of the 19th century. So there weren't people who had 6 generations of family here. So if you read again, or for the first time, I hope not, like Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence, which is all about how claustrophobic New York society is, one of the characters moves to Washington where she can breathe a little and remake herself. And that was the world that Edith moved into. Now, Edith was not rich, as Heath said, but she was young and beautiful. And 1890s Washington was a pretty interesting place to recreate yourself. So she loves it. She loves the music. She loves the buildings. She loves the Gilded Age mansions going up and down Massachusetts Avenue. Rock Creek Park is formed. The zoo is opened. The Washington Monument is finished. This is just an amazing time to be a young, beautiful woman in this booming, booming city. She tells a story in her memoir of there was a soprano she desperately wanted to see and she couldn't afford the ticket, but at the last minute, one of her sister's friends has a seat and says, you can have it if you get to the theater by 8. And she's so eager to go that she doesn't even bother to change into evening dress. She's wearing a green plaid dress, which I think is in the collection at the Woodrow Wilson House. And she tells this story that we can all relate to, where she's trying to get on the Herdick. The city Herdicks were these crazy horse-drawn buses. And it won't come, and she's running late, and she's sure she's going to disappoint her friends. And then she finally gets on the Herdic, and everyone who gets on doesn't have exact change, and she's going crazy watching the conductor slowly count out the coins, and it's getting later and later. She finally gets to the theater. It's all so magical and wonderful. She doesn't even care that she's, completely inappropriately dressed. And then she floats home on this high from this concert, and she finds her sister and her sister's husband sitting around the table with her sister's husband's cousin, Norman Galt. Again, Norman, who kept showing up. She was not enamored of Norman at first. By all accounts, he was a perfectly nice guy, Norman Galt. He was solid, he was kind, he was decent, he was a successful businessman, and Edith did not warm to him at first, but he sure was impressed with her. And he kept showing up and kept sort of making his case. And she could do a lot worse, and she really didn't want to go back to Wytheville. She does briefly. There's a couple of years of kind of back and forth, and will she or won't she? But finally, she marries Galt, and he owns Galt's jewelry store, which those of you who are from here in Washington know was an institution. It was sort of the Tiffany's of Washington for 200 years. It just closed in the last 10 or 15 years. And was founded in 1802. So, when Washington was basically a construction site, there was still Galt's. And so he's a person, even though he's in trade, which society people are snitty about, he's a person of some substance here in town. And he's financially secure, and he loves her. So she marries him. And they have one child who doesn't survive, and that leaves Edith unable to have more children. So they enjoy the life of secure, pretty well-to-do, childless folks in Washington. And Edith really likes that life. She becomes the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. The driver's license is in the collection at the Birthplace Museum. I see the Edith Bolling Wilson Birthplace Museum folks are here on the call, so you can go see this down there in Wytheville. This is from 1904. And she not only has a driver's license, but she's driving is this little electric car. She called her Little Electric. And these were these two-seater, not much more than a golf cart, frankly, that were marketed specifically to women as a sort of easy to run little runabout that gave you some measure of independence. And Edith loved her electric. She talked about it all the time. There were a lot of women riding bicycles at this time. If you read other memoirs of turn of the century Washington, there's a whole big fad of bicycles and what do you wear to ride your bicycle, and do you, actually become so unladylike as to wear that bloomer outfit and all of that. Edith wanted no part of the bicycle. She tried to learn later in the White House in the basement and never actually mastered it. But this little electric car was perfect for her. And she became so known actually for her little electric car around town that the policemen on 15th Street would stop traffic for her. And she has a great life. She's really enjoying it. And, biographers talk about her very frivolously in this time, which makes me nuts because yes, she was interested in beautiful clothes. And yes, she had lovely jewelry. She was married to a jeweler, but also she's supporting her entire family at this point. 3 of her brothers work for Galt's. All of them are supporting her unmarried sister, Bertha, and her mom. She is the total bedrock of the family. Her father dies during this time. Galt's father dies during this time. They are keeping the entire structure going. And she is responsible in this very demanding way that she doesn't get credit for at all because people just keep talking about her clothes. So she's, enjoying being a woman of some means, but she's also very responsible for her largely impoverished family. In 1908, Galt dies. And Edith inherits Galt's. This is still unusual in 1908. Married Women's Property Acts only were passed by all 50 states around the turn of the century. It was still considered a little suspect for a woman to be the executor of her husband's will and to solely inherit a business like Galt's. Had she had a son, or had Galt had a brother who wasn't an invalid, they might have made a case to sue for the inheritance of the business. And she could have had to fight that. As it happened, she wasn't in that position. So she was able to inherit Galt's, which was a profitable business, but Norman had bought out his brothers and his father to become sole owner. And he still owed on that debt. Even though the business was turning a profit, he still owed the shares that he had bought out of the other owners. And Edith kind of dithers about what to do. Should she sell the business, pay off the debts, be done with it? No one would have blamed her. She lived in a world where the majority of Americans thought women were too stupid and fragile to handle running a business. But again, her brothers work there. Her mother and sister are dependent on the earnings her brothers and she make from this store. If she pulls the rug out from under Galt's, the whole fragile balance comes tumbling down. She knows nothing about running a business, but she's completely confident that she can handle it. Because at every stage of her life, she's confident that she can handle it. She had no business moving to the big city. She had no business doing any of this, but she just thinks, I'll figure it out. I trust in my own smarts to figure it out. And she consults with the manager of the store and with her lawyer, and they figure out a way for her to basically take nothing out of the business for a few years, to live very frugally until the debts are paid off and the profit of the jewelry store is able to run itself. And she makes it happen. She gets out of debt. It's a going concern. She doesn't have to sell. She doesn't even have to borrow money to make this happen. It's impressive. And she would have been completely forgiven for bailing entirely, but she doesn't. So 1909, 1910, 1911, 1912, she is, God, is she gorgeous? She's gorgeous. She is enjoying being an independent, childless widow of means. Legally in in America, that is actually a very unusual status in terms of the level of independence a woman can achieve there. So for a white woman of her class with no debt and no children and being a respectable widow, she is free. She can travel. She doesn't need chaperones. She doesn't need to explain her spending to anybody. She can just go live her life in a way that her peers could not. And she absolutely makes the most of it. She goes to Europe every year. She goes with her sister Bertha. She kind of takes on a ward of sorts, a young woman named Alice Gertrude Gordon, known as Altrude. Altrude's mom had died young. Her father was a friend of Edith's. When he was ailing, he asked Edith to take care of Altrude. They really liked each other. They were good traveling companions. And Altrude was dating Carrie Grayson, the White House doctor. And Edith was very involved in their court trip because Altrude sort of ran hot and cold. She wasn't totally sure about Dr. Grayson. And Edith was constantly staging ways for them to meet, including in 1914, she took Altrude on vacation in New England so that they'd be pretty close to where the Wilsons took their summer White House in Cornish, New Hampshire, so that while Grayson was tending the Wilsons, he could come see Altrude not too far away. But as it happened, Grayson couldn't get away because Ellen Wilson was so sick that year. So Edith knows of the Wilsons, has this connection, but hasn't met them. Ellen Wilson dies. Carrie Grayson starts telling Edith how lonesome the president is and how at sea the women in his household are. The two younger daughters have married and moved out. The oldest daughter, Margaret, is around back and forth. She isn't always around. She has a singing career. She kind of moves around. There's a cousin, Helen Bones, who is more or less acting as White House hostess. She's kind of in over her head. And they're in mourning, right? They're sad. And Grayson says, they need a friend. You should be their friend. And Edith says, if they need people to introduce them to Washington society and take them to the right parties and stuff, I'm not the right person. I've never been part of that society and I have no interest in it. And he says, no, they need someone to take walks in Rock Creek Park with. They just need a companion who will make them laugh and be good company. And Edith was that 100%. So she becomes friends with Helen Bones and Margaret Wilson to some extent. And whether Helen Bones and Dr. Carrie Grayson actually engineered this meeting or whether it truly was an accident, opinions differ. But at one point, Edith and Helen come back from a walk in Rock Creek Park and almost literally run into Grayson and the president coming back from playing golf. The president down like timber, in love immediately, just so taken with Edith Galt. And she's a little stunned, right? It's, again, people write about her as being so beautiful and beautifully dressed and interested in these frivolous things. She's not actually romantic. Her marriage to Galt was pretty mercenary in some ways. The president, on the other hand, is super romantic, which surprises you if you think of him as that like incredibly buttoned up Presbyterian minister type, right? Like Teddy Roosevelt called him the apothecary's clerk, but he writes these very, very racy letters to Edith. And, you know, she starts to sort of respond in kind, but she's a little undone by the onslaught of attention. He proposes 5 weeks after they meet. She says, we don't even know each other that well. Your wife just died. What are you doing proposing? And she says, if it has to be yes or no today, my answer is no. But let's keep seeing each other and get to know each other better and see what happens. And the letters from this time I find so fascinating because he is gushing, right? And he's going on and on about how he wants to kiss her eyelids and blah, blah, blah. And she writes back, I love your letters. Any woman would. It's so flattering for you to gush so. But you know what I really like? I really like it when you talk to me about policy. I really like it when you tell me what you're working on and give me the intricacies of what's going on in your professional world. So he's all in, right? If flirting with her by policy analysis is what's going to work, he's happy to flirt with her by policy analysis. So he starts sending her packets of sometimes actually pretty sensitive material. And, you know, he runs his draft of the letter to the Germans following the sinking of the Lusitania by her. He it solicits her opinion about stuff that, again, in hindsight, why would she have an opinion about these things? She's never been in politics. She never went to college, but she turns out to be the kind of woman who was more successfully courted by policy analysis than by the eyelid kissing stuff. And that's completely in keeping with who she was. And so these letters and the packets of sensitive material going back and forth to her house in DuPont Circle keep up through 1915. By the end of the summer, they're engaged. By October, they've announced their engagement. The gossip columns are vicious about her being in trade. There's a whole fake scandal about a woman named Mary Peck, who Wilson corresponded with earlier. And, you know, was she selling her letters? And it's all designed to sort of make Wilson put the brakes on, because his own advisors are very worried that if he marries Galt before the 1916 election, any sympathy he has for being the grieving widower is going to be blown out of the water. But neither of them are all that. Even Edith thinks, you know, maybe we should wait till after the election, which she assumes he's going to lose, by the way. She thinks he's going to be defeated in 1916 and they can have this nice Washington life. He prevails. They marry in December of 1915, and she becomes First Lady, a job, as I've said, which has no job description. And she doesn't have children. His children are grown. She decides her role is to be Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. That's all her calling card said, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. Her whole job is to be next to him and help him. And, you know, most First Ladies who married the president, the eventual president, younger, have been part of his coming to power, part of his early campaigns, part of his, you know, working through his ambitions with him, cultivating political connections. Ellen Wilson was this way. But Edith comes in when he's already president. She doesn't need to be that person. She can just be with him. And she is very interested in being his closest confidant. And Wilson did not, he enjoyed his own counsel very much. He did not rely on a huge raft of advisors, but he had a couple of close confidants. And little by little, Edith becomes the closest of the closest confidants. And she probably would have been a pretty great society hostess, but she's saved from playing that role by World War I. So 1917, US is involved in World War I. She throws herself into wartime First Lady. She figures that out. She joins the Red Cross. There's sheep grazing on the White House lawn. She figures out what that sort of public collective sacrifice role is as the First Lady as a role model. And then after the armistice in 1918, when Wilson wants to go to Europe to negotiate the treaty himself, she goes with him. Now, there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not Wilson should go himself, whether he was diluting his moral authority by getting, you know, his hands dirty with the nitty-gritty of the treaty, but he clearly wanted to go. He was always going to go. And she wanted him to get what he wanted. So she goes with him. Not only is she the first lady to travel abroad, he's the first president to go to Europe while president. Either Taft or TR, one of them had gone to the Panama Canal Zone. That was the only other time a sitting president had left the country. So they go to Europe, and oh, this is their courtship picture. I think, this was a sort of montage that was put in the papers. I think whoever did the photo editing on this sort of had a mean streak. Their teeth are not attractive in this picture, but the press coverage got very caught up in the romance of the president, as you might imagine. So they go to Europe, and she's right there with the ruling heads of Europe, not as a plus one, but as the First Lady of the United States. And that elevates the role of that office in a way it never, ever had been before. Here she is standing next to Queen Mary, not because she's his date, but because she's just as an important representative of the US. There's some hilarious stuff about this picture because one of Wilson's pant cuffs is rolled up. And apparently King George made fun of him for not noticing that his pant cuff was rolled up in this picture. But so again, another chapter where she has no training for being a ceremonial wife on this level. She has not been like a lot of first ladies, the First Lady of New Jersey or something before this. But yes, I'll go to France. Yes, I will be completely involved in these negotiations. Yes, I will stand next to queens. I have no problem with that. She was that kind of a person. So then as Wilson starts to deteriorate in 1919, takes this ill-fated train trip and then collapses, ultimately comes back to Washington and has a massive stroke in October of 1919. If you take it all as the next chapter of Edith's story, it actually shouldn't surprise you that she made the decisions she did, that she was all about him. So hiding how sick he was from him, in addition to the American public, was totally of a piece of what she had done before, but also having the confidence to pull off a cover up on that scale, which is astounding when you think about it, right? That she managed to be enough of a guard dog that the truth really did not come out in any sort of, there were rumors and there were people who got angry about it, but there was not a sort of national doubt. We just last week, somebody sowed doubt about whether or not President Biden was actually acting as president because he's not tweeting enough, right? Can you imagine it 100 years ago? Very different world. So she pulls it off. She is his gatekeeper. We can argue about how involved she was and whether this first woman president stuff is valid and, why she had the motivation she had. There's a lot, I think, to mine there, but the fact remains she certainly did a completely unconstitutional job of stepping in when her husband was not able to serve the role he was elected to do. And then they retired to S Street and what is now the Woodrow Wilson House, our host today. I will say the other chapter I'm really interested in is her post-Wilson life. Her own memoir ends on the day Wilson dies in 1924, but she lived to 1961. This is one of her last public appearances with JFK. So, and I think those are various sayers in the background there, some descendants of Wilson's daughter, Jessie. So she was involved in Democratic politics. She becomes the honorary chair of the Women's National Democratic Club. She speaks at the Democratic Convention in 1928. Her name is occasionally floated as a vice presidential candidate. She's around, and she very much serves as the sort of grande dame of first ladies. She invites every first lady to tea and talks to them about what they can expect of their role. So I think there's a lot of very interesting 1924 to 1961 Edith life that is also very much largely ignored. So with that said, I know we want to have time for questions. So I will stop talking and stop sharing my screen.
Beautiful. That was really a great presentation, both Heath and Rebecca. Thank you very much. We do have some questions, I think, but the first question is going to come from me. And Heath, if your daughter Annie is on, I would love to ask her about her experience doing the movie with the Smithsonian.
She is joining us right now. So I will let her come on and let you maybe re-ask that question one more time.
Sure. Hi, Annie. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I love that you accompanied your mother to make the movie for the Smithsonian. Can you tell us just a little bit what it was like to A, watch your mom in action, but B, to learn more about Edith Wilson?
So I've always kind of traveled around with my mom as she's kind of done her thing pretty much all throughout growing up and stuff like that. I've been dragged to talks here and there. So, it's not surprising to actually watch her, do her thing. However, I've never seen her film anything, so it was kind of cool to see that aspect of it and really see kind of how documentaries are filmed, because I've never been a part of that. I've never seen it. I really didn't even know how much work goes into it. Because I was tired at the end of the day. Like, I was done. Like, I was hungry. And I just didn't think it would be, so much effort put into it, and to see it kind of play out and to see the final result, it looks really good. And I just learned so much on filming with it, like how the canaries were. And that was kind of interesting to me that she buried her dead canaries, which is kind of weird, but it's kind of funny, or well, not funny, but interesting.
It is funny.
And, to go throughout the actual house, and kind of have that space to yourself and really be able to see it in depth more than anyone else, because you are there all day and you are looking at everything else, is really interesting. So yeah.
Great. That's wonderful. And it's always rewarding to hear, bring your child to work day. This was really bring your child to work all day.
It was all day. We had to feed her Skeeter's hot dogs from next door to keep her energy up. So,
That's
but
great.
she did well. She acted interested. She played that role well. And then Edith's driver's license, she thought was pretty interesting. Remember the driver's
Yes.
license that
Yeah.
Sharon showed us?
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah.
Well, anytime I think about Edith in Withville, I always think I need to stand up and sit up straight, because as soon as you said that, I saw everyone on the screen who I could see kind of perk themselves up. We all have a grandmother who told us to sit up straight. Thank you, Annie. That was great. I'm going to go to the chat and ask some of the questions. For those of you who are wondering, first of all, this is recorded. So if you miss it, or you missed the beginning, or you have friends you want to share with it, this will be on our YouTube channel. But also there are some links in the chat to, for instance, the documentary Madam President can be watched on the Smithsonian networks. And so there are some links there. If you are familiar with how the chat works, please go ahead and copy those addresses down. One of the questions came in was, what was the relationship between Edith Wilson and the daughters who were pro-suffrage? So how do you have a woman who is not for suffrage with new 3 stepdaughters who are pro-suffrage?
So as I mentioned, I think Edith's relationship with suffrage is fascinating because you would expect her, in all of her independence and her trailblazing to some degree as a woman business owner, to also think that the franchise was hers to execute. I think some of it is, and actually Heath sent me a really interesting article from the Wythe County Historical Association that talks about how socially it was not what nice girls did, right? That being sort of out front there, insisting on a voice in the man's sphere was anathema to the way she was raised. And that is certainly an argument that was raised by a lot of anti-suffragists, that women should be proud of their role in the private sphere, and that insisting on a role in the public sphere was somehow denigrating the importance of their life at home. I think also the National Women's Party activists who picketed the White House in 1917 were so directly criticizing Wilson that just made her mad. She was very protective of him and his reputation, and they were out there with banners saying, "Kaiser Wilson, take the beam out of your own eye." And she found them disgusting in their forwardness, but she also really didn't like that they were criticizing him. So I think in general, she actually had a pretty good relationship with Margaret and Jesse and Nell. I think that they knew that their dad really needed a wife and was not doing well as a widower. And it sounds like they all coexisted actually pretty peacefully, but they disagreed. And I don't think they swayed the daughters. I don't think they swayed their father very much. And they certainly didn't sway their stepmother. Wilson, came around to supporting the federal amendment quite late. He had said that suffrage should be a state by state issue before that. And that was often sort of thinly veiled racism. It was a sense that the Reconstruction amendments had been federal overreach, and it was a way to keep Southern states from feeling like the federal government was imposing too much on them too quickly. And a lot of Southern states were really not interested in enfranchising Black women in any way. They were systematically disenfranchising Black men at the time. So he finally supported the 19th Amendment really after the writing was on the wall, after New York passed suffrage in 1917. He sort of realized that the Democratic Party was going to get blamed. And he, as the leader of the Democratic Party, for not supporting it, and he needed to come around. So he was a reluctant adopter of the 19th Amendment.
Another question came in from Lauren. How old is she in that last photo with JFK? And is her arm broken? It looks like it's in a cast.
Yeah, good eye. It is in a cast. She's 89 in that picture. She died later that year.
The documentary.
Still beautifully dressed.
Still beautifully dressed. And there is recently an article about how JFK was influenced by Wilson. I think it just came out this week on my news feed of every single day there is something about Woodrow Wilson in the news, and I get it on my feed. And just recently was about JFK being influenced by Woodrow Wilson. So we have the link to it. She's 89 in that photo, yes. And then, as noted, Edith Wilson's memoir ends with the president's passing, but my first edition is dated 1938. Why did it take so long to have it published?
So I answered that in the chat, but the actual answer is that she wasn't initially planning on writing a memoir necessarily. But I would say everyone in the Wilson administration wrote a memoir. I have now read all of them. I see Garrett Peck on the call. I'm sure he has read all of them too. Elizabeth, I'm sure you have read all of them. I think everybody, even tangentially involved in that administration, wrote a memoir. And she got mad about some of them. She thought that they were not representing her husband in the way that she wanted him to be represented. And she was really dedicated to curating his reputation after he died. And so in her telling, she sat down and started dashing off her memoir on the train while she was still sort of livid about the latest version from somebody else. And so that's why it was 14 years after his death.
And then the question is, does Edith have any relatives alive today?
Yeah, I think Carrie Fuller is on the call with us. So he maybe can write in the chat. We have Carrie, we have some cousins. Farron Smith, who is on the call, can also probably detail the cousins that are still alive, and Carrie, of course. So yes, there are quite a few still around.
Yes. I do see Carrie on the call, and I should say that these talks are made possible through generous donations for our speaker series. And this talk, for instance, is sponsored by Carrie Fuller, and our other sponsors are Ed Gerber, Nancy Bliss, and Chris Keller. So I thank all of them for making this possible. I think, are there any other relatives? Farron, do you want to point out anyone, or else someone else on the line? No. Any other questions?
I saw a question about Mary Peck. How did Edith respond to Woodrow Wilson's relationship with Mary Peck? So Wilson had certainly an emotional, maybe a physical affair with Mary Peck. He certainly wrote her many, many letters that, while clean, there was no eyelid kissing in his letters to Mary Peck. They certainly were confidential in a way that seemed a little inappropriate between married people. And she was very protective of those letters, but there were rumors that they were going to get released to the press way back in the 1912 campaign. That was when Theodore Roosevelt said, oh, no one would believe Wilson as a Romeo. He looks like an apothecary's clerk. And then his own advisors, Wilson's own advisors, mainly Secretary McAdoo, Nell's husband, who was in the cabinet, so kind of cooked up this scheme to pretend to Wilson that Mary Peck was going to release her letters to get him to maybe back off marrying Edith. So it's a little unclear what the end game was there. So Edith knew about Mary Peck back in 1915 and decided to go ahead with her marriage to Wilson anyway. So in her words, she said, I knew about her and decided there was no fire there, just smoke, and it was all okay. So then in 1919, when they're on that ill-fated train tour, there is one day in LA that Wilson might actually get a chance to rest from his grueling schedule, but instead he has lunch with Mary Peck. And Edith says she had to go and she had to approve it because otherwise the scandal mongers would make a big deal of her snubbing Mary Peck, and they'd try to turn this old controversy into something real. I will say both Mary Peck and Edith wrote about that lunch, and neither was especially kind about what the other woman looked like. But for the most part, Edith won that battle. She didn't need to worry about Mary Peck. She was the one who was married to him. So she could afford to be magnanimous about it for sure.
Well, that wraps up the conclusion. She's bold, she's brave, she's complicated, she's beautiful. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone. We do have one more comment. Edith's great niece, Betty Evans, is on the line as well. Betty's grandmother was Edith's sister. And Farron, today, Edith has 3 relatives living who knew her: Carrie Fuller, Sterling Bolling, our great nephews, and of course, Betty Evans, the great niece. So with that, her legend continues. And we thank all of you for coming today, joining us on the line. In 2 weeks, we will have a professor from the University of Virginia, Philip Zelikow, talk about the Great War. And it promises to be a wonderful talk. I look forward to seeing you then. I thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much, Heath Lee and Rebecca Roberts. My pleasure to have you today. And thanks to Annie Lee as well for joining in. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.